What if one of the most powerful engineers on Earth didn't wear a hard hat, didn't rely on machinery, and never once drafted a blueprint? What if it didn't speak, didn't plan, and never charged a single dollar for its labor, yet managed to outperform government infrastructure, military-grade engineering, and billion-dollar restoration projects? It sounds unbelievable, even absurd. And yet in the parched valleys and fire-scorched forests of Washington state, that silent miracle worker wasn't a corporation, or a scientist, or a politician. It was a rodent. A stocky, flat-tailed, branch-chewing creature weighing no more than 50 pounds. The beaver. These unlikely hydrologists were released into lands that most experts had already written off as dead. There were no trees left for shade, no clean streams, not even a trickle of flowing water. Salmon, once the lifeblood of the Pacific rivers, had vanished entirely. Farmers were at war over every remaining inch of irrigation. The earth was cracked, the forests were charred, the rivers had turned into shallow graveyards of algae and poison. By every human metric, the landscape was finished. But within just a few years of reintroduction, satellite imagery revealed something no one had anticipated. Subsurface water began rising again beneath the soil, as if waking from a long coma. Seasonal wildfires, once an unstoppable menace, dropped by nearly 40%. And against all reasonable expectations, sockeye salmon began returning to streams where they had been declared extinct. How could this possibly have happened? What did these beavers do that countless restoration projects, environmental regulations, and human interventions had failed to achieve? To understand the true depth of their impact, we must rewind to the moment Washington's ecological crisis began its rapid descent. Since the early 2000s, a devastating trifecta had been tightening its grip across the Pacific Northwest. Extreme heat waves, prolonged droughts, and record-setting wildfires. Each summer seemed hotter than the last, each river lower, each season drier. Water temperatures climbed so high that salmon eggs began dying before they could hatch, and adult fish, trying to swim upstream, were literally forced to turn back or perish mid-journey. Then came the fires, relentless, hungry flames that swept through riparian forests, the lush, river-bordering woodlands that once cooled the streams and sheltered entire ecosystems. Nearly 70% of these forests were reduced to ash and smoke. With the trees gone, the rivers lost their protection. No shade meant higher temperatures. No roots meant unstable soil. Streams that had once meandered peacefully through shaded corridors suddenly eroded into wide, shallow beds, their water evaporating faster than nature could replenish it. The land hardened. The sun baked the exposed earth until it turned hydrophobic, water-repellent like dry clay. Rain, when it finally did arrive, no longer soaked in. Instead, it raced across the hardened surface, dragging mud, ash, broken branches, and even salmon eggs with it. What should have been life-giving rainfall turned into violent mudslides, thick black torrents tearing down slopes, smashing through farmland, and poisoning whatever remained downstream. By the height of dry season, as much as 70% of the Yakima River's visible flow wasn't natural water at all. It was reused discharge, wastewater loaded with nitrates from fertilizers, phosphates from detergents, and pesticide residue from the fields. Under the brutal summer sun, this water transformed into a toxic broth, bubbling with algae blooms that suffocated fish and stained the riverbeds green. The cycle was vicious, and it was accelerating. Drought leading to wildfire, wildfire to erosion, erosion to poisoned runoff to dead fish, and dead fish to dead rivers. Washington wasn't just drying, it was unraveling. Faced with ecological collapse, engineers, lawmakers, and local communities scrambled for answers. Proposals flooded in, each promising salvation, yet each carrying a price far too steep or risks far too great. Some pushed for the construction of large-scale water storage reservoirs, massive basins carved into the land, capable of stockpiling water during wet months for use in summer. On paper, it seemed practical. In reality, each reservoir cost anywhere from $500,000 to over $2 million, while permanently scarring the very landscapes they were meant to protect. Their walls blocked animal movement. Their stagnant pools disrupted natural flow. Worst of all, they addressed symptoms, not causes. Others suggested the installation of long, costly pipelines to divert water from larger rivers. But the idea crashed almost as soon as it was introduced. Legal battles erupted over water rights. Environmental laws stalled construction. Communities downstream refused to sacrifice their flow so that others upstream could survive. Water, once abundant enough to share freely, had become a political battlefield. A third idea emerged: artificial dam models. Concrete, steel, and timber structures placed across streams to mimic the behavior of natural dams. They appeared promising in places like Utah and Oregon. But according to a 2017 study by the University of Idaho, these man-made barriers were easily damaged during heavy rainfall, required constant maintenance, and most importantly, lacked the living intelligence of real ecosystems. A human-built structure could hold water, but it could not adapt. It could not grow at the pace of a flood. It could not self-repair. It could not decide instinctively when to let water pass and when to hold it. As options dwindled, a radical idea surfaced. It was so simple, so primitive that many dismissed it outright. What if, rather than building dams, we simply let nature build them? What if the engineers best suited for the task were not humans at all, but the very species that had been constructing dams long before humans knew how to mix mortar? What if beavers, once seen as pests, were instead reinstated as partners? It sounded like fantasy, but to the farmers watching their crops die, to the ecologists witnessing streams vanish, and to the tribal elders who still remembered when these lands pulsed with life, the idea made perfect, undeniable sense. Why? Because before Washington's rivers fell silent, before drought and concrete straightened their curves, these waters had once been home to thousands upon thousands of beaver dams. Each one was a living water storage facility, a natural regulator, a sediment trap, a temperature stabilizer, a biodiversity generator. These dams didn't just block water, they slowed it, allowing it to seep sideways into the soil, where it could remain cool and protected from evaporation. They didn't just collect debris, they filtered it, purifying muddy water into clear channels. They didn't just feed forests, they created them. And when beavers were hunted nearly to extinction, something far larger disappeared with them. It wasn't just a species, it was an entire system, a quiet, age-old choreography between land, water, and life itself. As the American Fisheries Society once warned, losing beaver dams means losing one of the most important wetland ecosystems in the American West. For too long, humanity had believed it could replace nature with engineering. Winding streams were straightened into hard channels. Riverbeds were lined with concrete. Water was forced to move as fast as possible, as if slowing down were an error instead of a gift. But in winter, that speed created destructive flash floods, and in summer, it left riverbeds empty. The evidence was undeniable. No man-made structure could match what beavers had been perfecting for millions of years. So for the first time in modern history, environmentalists, scientists, and farmers agreed on something surprising. It was time to give the rivers back to their oldest architects. And so, in 2007, one of the most unexpected and innovative ecological restoration efforts in the United States quietly began. It was called the Methau Beaver Project. Rather than breeding beavers in captivity or importing them from distant habitats, the project chose a simpler, more practical approach. Beavers that had been causing trouble in urban areas, clogging drainage pipes, flooding backyards, or chewing down ornamental trees, were carefully trapped. They were not euthanized as might have happened in years past. Instead, they were given health checks, fitted with tiny GPS tracking chips, gently crated, and transported by specialized trucks deep into the highlands of the Methau and Yakima watersheds, the very regions their ancestors once shaped. During some releases, members of local Native American communities, including the Colville tribe, gathered to welcome them home. Sage smoke ceremonies were held. Prayers were spoken. It wasn't just science, it was restoration, ecological, cultural, and spiritual. The most astonishing part? The cost. To relocate and monitor a pair of beavers, two animals capable of constructing multiple dams within weeks, came to just $2,000. That included transport, veterinary care, radio tracking, and post-release observation. 20 times cheaper than building a single artificial dam. By 2021, in the Methau watershed alone, over 240 beavers had been reintroduced across more than 50 strategic sites. Despite their territorial nature, 64% of the translocated beavers successfully settled into their new homes, an impressive figure, given that each beaver had to adapt to unfamiliar terrain, find food, and survive predators. Yet even with these promising numbers, expectations remained modest. Maybe people thought the beavers would build a few small dams, perhaps hold a bit of seasonal runoff. At best, they might slow erosion or provide a few wet patches for wildlife. But no one predicted what happened next. Within just a few months, the Methau and Yakima valleys began to whisper a secret that humans had long forgotten. Water remembers. Beavers, liberated into these parched lands, didn't just nibble on branches, they orchestrated entire landscapes. Every stick they chewed, every lodge they built, every dam they assembled acted like a tiny switchboard, redirecting water into dry channels, filling up shallow basins, and saturating soil that had been baked hard for years. Seasonal rivulets that had disappeared during decades of drought now shimmered under the summer sun. Satellite images captured the transformation. Areas once barren and brown began to gleam in patches of emerald green. Small pools of water multiplied like islands in a desert. Sediment trapped behind the dam's rebuilt stream banks. The earth, it seemed, was breathing again. Even more astonishingly, the beavers' work wasn't static. Unlike human dams, which require constant repair, these living structures evolved naturally. When a storm came, a dam might break in one place, but the beavers would repair it in another, shifting the flow where it was most effective. Nature, in its most ancient and patient form, had returned to its rhythm, and for the first time in decades, humans weren't in control. They were witnessing a process that exceeded every prediction. Wildlife followed quickly. Frogs that hadn't been seen in the region for years began to croak from newly formed ponds. Birds nested in the shrubs that sprouted along water-filled terraces. Even salmon, those silver lifelines of the Pacific Northwest, started returning to streams where they had once vanished entirely. In some reconnected tributaries, surveys reported the first salmon eggs hatching in over 50 years. The numbers spoke for themselves. By 2015, studies found that soil moisture in the rewilded zones had increased by up to 20%. Seasonal wildfire risk decreased dramatically, as wetlands now acted like natural fire breaks. Streams that had run dry in July now held enough water to sustain aquatic life well into late summer. What had once seemed like a small, almost symbolic gesture, reintroducing a few dozen beavers, had sparked a cascade of ecological restoration that no human engineer could have imagined. And the most remarkable part? This transformation wasn't fueled by technology, machinery, or billion-dollar budgets. It was fueled by instinct, evolution, and persistence. The beavers didn't plan. They didn't innovate consciously. They simply did what they had been doing for millions of years. And in doing so, they taught humans a lesson that no report, law, or policy ever could. Sometimes, the simplest solutions are the most profound. But this was only the beginning. While the Methau project showed what a few dozen beavers could accomplish, scientists were about to discover that when these creatures returned en masse, their collective impact could reshape entire watersheds, rivers, and even the climate resilience of a region. What began as a handful of relocated beavers quickly became something far larger, a network of engineers reshaping an entire ecosystem quietly and invisibly, one dam at a time. Where soil had been baked and cracked, vegetation began to re-emerge. Willows, alders, and cottonwoods, trees that once lined the riverbanks, sprouted from the saturated soil. Wetlands expanded, meadows appeared where none had existed for decades, and with new plants came new animals. Beavers, it turns out, are not just water managers, they are architects of life. Bird populations exploded. Species that had abandoned the area for lack of cover returned to nest along the revived streams. Dragonflies buzzed over newly formed ponds. Frogs and salamanders, once absent from these valleys, became the soundtrack of summer nights. Predators followed prey, and suddenly, a food web that had been broken for generations began to hum with life once more. Salmon, the ultimate indicator of ecological health, experienced a renaissance. In the Yakama River Basin, biologists recorded a 70% increase in juvenile salmon survival in areas with active beaver dams compared to those without. Suddenly, the rivers were not just flowing, they were pulsing with life. Even the land itself changed. Soil that had been hard, dry, and cracked now held moisture deep beneath the surface. The saturated earth acted as a natural sponge during storms, reducing destructive mudslides and flooding downstream. Farmers, once despairing over parched fields, noticed groundwater levels rising, wells filling more reliably, and even crops growing more resilient to dry spells. The Methau project's results were not just ecological, they were economic, cultural, and social. Tribal communities saw salmon returns that had seemed impossible. Local farmers witnessed water management improvements that no expensive engineering project could match. Scientists marveled at how a single species working instinctively could deliver such a multi-dimensional solution. And the story doesn't stop there. The Methau project inspired neighboring watersheds to attempt similar efforts. Beavers were reintroduced into other degraded valleys across the Pacific Northwest. In every case, the results were astonishingly consistent. Water returned, forests regrew, wildlife flourished, and ecosystems that humans had deemed lost were reborn. By 2023, ecologists estimated that beaver activity had restored over 10,000 acres of wetlands in Washington state alone. Wildfire risk decreased dramatically, sediment control improved, and biodiversity soared. The beavers hadn't just repaired rivers, they had become a keystone for regional climate resilience. What had started as a radical, almost desperate experiment had turned into one of the most cost-effective, powerful, and beautiful solutions to environmental collapse ever attempted. And yet, it all began with a simple, almost absurd idea. What if we stopped trying to control nature and let nature lead? The Methau and Yakima watersheds stand today as living proof of a radical truth. Sometimes the smallest creatures carry the greatest power. In just a few years, beavers, creatures often dismissed as pests or nuisances, transformed dead land into thriving, resilient ecosystems. They reminded humans that intelligence does not always wear a lab coat, that innovation does not always come with blueprints, and that restoration sometimes requires stepping aside and letting life take the reins. The lessons are clear. First, restoration does not always require complex engineering or massive budgets. Nature, when given the chance, has been solving these problems for millions of years. Beavers don't just build dams, they build stability, biodiversity, and resilience. Their work infiltrates every layer of the ecosystem, from soil to streams, from plants to predators. Second, solutions often emerge where we least expect them. Humans had rewritten rivers, straightened streams, and controlled water with machinery. But these interventions could not replicate the adaptability, intelligence, and persistence of a single beaver. When we return species to their native habitats, we are not just restoring animals, we are restoring the processes that make landscapes healthy and self-sustaining. And finally, there is a deeper lesson about humility. In the Methau, the Yakima, and across the Pacific Northwest, humans witness something profound. Ecosystems are not problems to be solved, they are relationships to be understood. By trusting these relationships, by observing, facilitating, and stepping back, we allow life itself to do what it does best. Today, the rivers flow with water, salmon, and songbirds. Forests grow along their edges, meadows glimmer with ponds, fire risk is lower, soil holds moisture. And all of this incredible large-scale restoration, was sparked by a single simple idea: give the beavers back their home. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know about power, intelligence, and progress. The most profound engineering project on Earth, it turns out, does not wear a hard hat. It chews wood, slaps mud, and works silently in the shadows. And yet, in its quiet way, it reshapes the world. So next time you see a beaver lodge, a meandering stream, or a pool reflecting the sky, remember, the architects are still at work. And sometimes the solutions we need have been under our noses all along. If you're inspired by the quiet genius of the beaver, consider sharing this story. Comment below, what natural engineer do you think deserves more credit for shaping our world? And explore our other videos to witness more extraordinary stories of nature's overlooked power.